Bonus 3, A Perspective on Palestine. Imagine if you can that the passport that you hold, the nationality that you were born into, condemns you to be hated by the rest of the world. That is the lived experience of the Palestinian national. This is Matthew, and in this episode of Still Unbelievable, Andrew and I talk to Daniel, a Palestinian Christian. We don't need to share his religion in order to recognise his humanity or his right to live in peace. The Palestinian experience is one of poverty and subjugation. It is one of constant deference to their privileged neighbour who gets handouts that they can only dream of. Could you live like that? I couldn't. I can absolutely imagine those lived conditions turning me into a radical prepared to give my life for a greater cause. Daniel speaks from the heart with a grace that is deeply attractive. And yet the pain his fellow countrymen are experiencing is vivid. As always, there will be links in the show notes to relevant locations. Please use them. Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable. This is number 3 in a series of 3 bonus episodes that I am delivering to you. Well, I say I mean Andrew and myself, of course, that we are delivering to you in this very uncomfortable period in international politics. So you've just heard 2 episodes of Andrew and myself talking to Eric about Israel and some of the legal issues around the state of Israel, Eric being the Jew that we spoke to. Now we're going to talk to Daniel. Daniel is a voice that I absolutely wanted to get on as soon as I heard him on the New Evangelicals podcast, link in the show notes, listeners. So if you want to hear more of Daniel, I do recommend the New Evangelicals podcast and specifically his episode. There will be a link in the show notes, as I just said. So, Daniel, I heard that conversation. I heard you talking to Tim over on the New Evangelicals and decided that, yes, this is somebody who I want to have a conversation with. He comes across reasonably. He comes across without the venom that is very easy to hear in the news reporting is about today. So I sent Tim over at New Evangelicals a quick message saying, Tim, I would love to talk to Daniel. Could you please put me in touch? And Tim did exactly that. So props to Tim. Thank you, Tim, over at New Evangelicals. And Daniel, welcome to Still Unbelievable. Tell us who you are.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Andrew. It's good to be with you guys in this conversation. I know this is like the talk of the town right now, and I'm kind of pleased that you're providing a space for us Palestinians, or especially me here specifically, to talk with you about the Palestine issue and our point of view that has been largely ignored or silenced or even vilified, especially in the West. About myself, my name is Daniel Bannura. I am a Palestinian Christian. I think my Christian identity is significant in the way that I think about Palestine and Israel. We can talk about it. I was born in Jerusalem, grew up in Bethlehem. My family is from this small town right next to Bethlehem called Beit Sahur, or the biblical, for those who care about this stuff, the biblical shepherd's field. So it's basically the farming land on the east side of Bethlehem, where the shepherds supposedly would have been when Christ was born in Bethlehem. Kind of grew up in that hometown, spent some time in the U.S. as well growing up, finished high school, came to the U.S. and been doing my undergraduate studies and my graduate studies here in the U.S. I don't know if this matters to the audience, I was doing my undergraduate in physics, in physics in 2007 and 8, and then a friend of mine in the physics department told me, hey, you're a Christian, you should read this book by Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion. And I'm like, oh, what? No way. I don't like, why, what? I do physics. I don't do religion. And then basically read that book, and to Richard's disappointment, that made me want to study theology after physics. So I finished because he made some really big statements and critiques of Christianity. I'm like, you know what, I'm going to take this on. I want to see if there's anything to what Richard Dawkins was saying. So I finished my bachelor's of science in physics, and then got a master's in theology and in London, London School of Theology, and then got a second master's. I got interested in Christian and Muslim issues, and then got a second master's at the University of Chicago in the study of Islam. And now I'm currently at the University of Notre Dame finishing my PhD studies, working on the Quran, on the Muslim holy text in relation to its late antique Christian background. So that's another topic for another episode. But as a Palestinian, the conversations about life in Palestine, about the conflict, have always been part of my identity. And especially here in the US, where people just are very curious and ask a lot of questions, and especially because of so many stereotypical attitudes, whether they're like Islamophobic or anti-Arab, and we can unpack a lot of kind of Western attitudes towards the Middle East and so on, that I think impact the way that people here think about Palestine and Israel. But yeah, that's it in a nutshell. And I've kind of been involved in conversations about Palestine, Israel, but also as a theologian, been doing a lot of work as well with Palestinian Christians on unpacking how we understand the Bible, and especially when the Bible has been used very effectively, I think, by Christians in the West to justify Israeli policies and its activities in Palestine, and use the Bible. And this is kind of where the Bible has been weaponized against Palestinians, and especially for me as a Palestinian Christian, where the Bible has been weaponized and used as a tool to justify the oppression and the occupation of the Palestinian lands and bodies and so on. And we can unpack that if you guys want. Do my research on the side, which is kind of really not on the side of my main focus and kind of where I spend most of my time. But since the attacks on October 7th, I've been doing a lot of work on advocating for the Palestinian people and speaking up in theological terms and Christian terms, but also in like political terms, like how can we make sense of what's happening right now. So I don't know if that helps with that conversation, but yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you, Daniel. There are a couple of questions I've got, and I'm pretty sure Andrew has as well. But I guess the first one that I want to ask is, over the past 3 weeks, nearly 4 weeks now, how has life been for you personally in the United States? Because you're clearly non-white. Does that affect how the average American treats you? Does being a Christian have a bonus for you being in the United States?
I don't know if my Christianity plays a role here. I think maybe I'm listened to. Maybe people have more patience to understand my perspective and listen because I'm a Christian. I live in a very privileged and safe space, like here in Midwest Indiana in the US. I'm also part of like an academic like community at the university, so it's very detached and removed from a lot of the tension and the conflict, and it's a very kind of elitist, comfortable space. I have a lot to say about the non-action and the apathy of the academic space when it comes to lived experiences. They're more concerned to think about stuff that happened in the Middle Ages or intellectual theoretical things versus actually something that is real and effective and affective and impactful on people's lives and humanity. And so I've been okay as in where I am and where I function. I think it's just been hard for me to be able to focus and be productive and do my work, and it's been a bit tough for me to do that. I have a lot of friends in Gaza, and I haven't heard from a number of them in a very long time. I know at least 3 or 4 of my friends have lost relatives. A friend, Maha, lost her brother. Yusuf lost 2 of his cousins. Hamad lost his dad. And all of that in the last week or so. So that's been just really, really tough for me. It's something that all Palestinians feel, and I can try to make sense of it. But there's this, I think it's like a fact that Palestinian life is not really considered of any value, and we're talking about right now today. This is November 2nd. We're talking about almost more than 9,000 Palestinians have been killed. More than 3,000 of them are children. And being in the West, honestly, like I feel safe, Matthew, and like I'm okay physically, but it's a very hard place to be in right now, where everyone around me, not everyone, of course, there are plenty of allies and friends and advocates, but the public and official discourse is very antagonistic to me and to my people, whether it's from the president, who we thought, he came to power and he was like, our foreign policy is going to be based on human rights and the rule of law and democracy. and he is like unwavering in his support for the genocide that is being committed right now in Gaza. The politicians, the media pundits, the media agencies, also for me, and Christians as well, who have been very unwavering in their just vociferous and just bloodthirsty kind of attitudes. Let's kill them all. Let's flatten Gaza, kill them all. And Palestinians in many ways are not given the benefit of a context or a story. Wouldn't like they're not worth anything. And you pointed out my skin color, my race, like, yeah, and I think the last few weeks just made me realize that white supremacy isn't just an issue about white and black issues, but it's actually way more entrenched and has a lot of colonial backgrounds. And we can talk about it, especially for you, Matthew, as someone who's a product of the British Empire. And we can talk about
You've
that.
You've done your research. Congratulations, sir.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, but because the issue in Palestine, Israel, kind of really began because of British support for Jewish migration and the Balfour Declaration. But for as a minority, as a brown person here, I'm kind of, there's this kind of rude awakening when I'm just seeing how just there's no value given to the Palestinian life and Palestinian background, and there's and like you hear the Israeli politicians saying there is no innocent Palestinian. We cannot say that the refugee camp that was bombed in Gaza had civilians or innocents killed. We don't say that they were innocent Nazis. And Palestinians are all Nazis basically because of Hamas. And there's this kind of this dehumanization of the Palestinian story and also the Palestinian suffering. So like if we're saying that 1,300 Israelis were killed, it is okay for us and it's totally justified. And we won't even blink an eye when we're saying that 3,000 Palestinian children were killed, and babies and fetuses have been killed in this kind of just nasty war that Israel has been launching on Gaza. So it's been very hard to be in this space where I just kind of feel like I live in enemy territory here. I feel like everyone is against me or against my people, at least in the official public sense. So it could be very alienating and lonely. Thankfully, I'm not on my own, and thankfully I have my wife and my little kids that provide a good support system for me, and also just wonderful friends and allies, whether on campus at the university or like all over the world, really. And also, especially also in the US, there's like a strong anti-war, pro-Palestine, pro-justice movement in the US. And I don't know if you guys have seen the protests, like massive protests happening all over the US. And there's a huge one coming up on the 4th of November in DC. And it's going to be basically, it's billed as the largest demonstration for Palestine in American history. So there's a lot of public awareness about what's happening. There's a lot of interest in all of this stuff. Social media has played a significant role in this, I think. People have become more self-critical, but also more reflective and more nuanced in the way they think about it. So that's kind of helpful. But it's coming at the expense of so many deaths, whether on the Israeli side, but more significantly for me and for us, hopefully, also the Palestinian side, where the vast majority of those who were killed are innocents. So yeah, that's, I guess, my long answer to your simple question, Matthew.
Yeah, just to pick up that final point on yours, I think that's my observation as well. The international community, certainly the European community, let me rephrase that, there does certainly seem to be awareness that whatever the narrative, the official narrative that's going on in that part of the world, it's far more nuanced. It's not black and white. There is no good side and bad side. There is atrocities everywhere. And you mentioned some names of people who have perished. So just for clarity, because I don't doubt it, but just for clarity for my listeners and for anybody listening in the future, the people that you mentioned and you named that they are Palestinian civilians. These are not people who are Hamas members.
These are no, and I mean your question, Matthew. Like it's, I know where you're coming from, but yeah, there's this like assumption that, like, yeah, there's like if a Palestinian dies, well, are they Hamas or do they deserve it? No, these are Palestinian like civilians. They're not connected to Hamas. Hamas only is a small minority in the Gaza Strip. Talking about a few 10,000 people. But these are mostly civilians. When we're talking about the vast majority of those who were killed are either children or women. And you have, and also that doesn't mean that every man who dies is like a Hamas member. And like this is not how Israel functions. And Israel has been clear from the beginning that they're not really trying to target Like they're not aiming for accuracy, they're aiming for damage. They're aiming to maximize the Palestinian casualty, and that's kind of been a policy that has been in effect for many years. Like every Palestinian is a suspect, every Palestinian is a threat to Israel, and I can talk about how that plays out demographically or politically and so on. But no, these have nothing to do with Hamas. And if they happen to be Muslim, and we can also talk about many Christians who were killed. There was a bombing at a church, an airstrike hit a church and killed like 20 Christians. And I don't know any of these Christians who were killed, but friends of mine know them. Israeli bombs they're not really trying to target Hamas militants. But also, how do we know? Like, does Israel tell us who they're targeting or who killed, who's dead and who isn't dead? Like, is there any kind of due process? Like, if you're a member of Hamas, like by definition, you deserve to die. Like, there's no like political or like kind of legal system that we can like implement here, because those who committed the attacks in Israel were all killed by the Israeli military, within a day or two. So who are we bombing? Are we bombing people who feel like, yeah, Hamas is a political party that I belong to, or civil servants who work in the government, because Hamas is also a political party, and it has a militia, those who are engaging in armed struggle, and we can talk about the history there. But you get a job at like the office, for like licensing or permits, and you become a Hamas member because you're part of that party. So therefore, ergo, you deserve to die. So this language of the terrorists, and has been super problematic, and it's a very harmful, I think, is a very like bigoted attitude in the West. If you're a terrorist or if you're Hamas, therefore you have no family, you have no story, you have no justification. You are guilty just by association. Or if you're a wife of a Hamas member, then of course you can die with your husband, and we can talk about human shields and all that propaganda that Israel uses all the time. Sorry, I'm giving you long answers here, but I think there's a lot to unpack, and that comes behind the question, Matthew. But no, the people I mentioned to you these are Ultimate Frisbee coaches. I coach Ultimate. I'm part of the Ultimate Palestine Association, like for Ultimate Frisbee in Palestine, and all of these individuals are coaches that I know, Muhammad and Yusuf, and they have nothing to do with Hamas. These are just simple, poor people who do sports and coach Ultimate for kids, and they have nothing to do with Hamas.
I'm sorry, Andrew.
Daniel, first let me say that I share your outrage over a war that is being prosecuted among civilians.
Right.
There is no sense in which that is okay or justifiable. In a world where we have smart bombs that can target individuals from who knows how, from who knows what distance, from quite a long way away. We have bunker buster bombs that tunnel without creating the kind of surface destruction that we're seeing in Gaza. In my own personal view, for whatever it's worth, I think it's heinous. I think it's wrong. And there's no sense in which the U.S. should be allying itself with the prosecution of a war among civilians.
Right.
That, I think, is easy. This is just easy stuff. So I'm sorry, deeply sorry, that you have lost friends and that your friends have lost friends. And so I just want that bit on record up front. And
thanks. Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. Yeah.
So the first thing that I wonder, because now the name Hamas has been spoken for the listeners, are Palestinian Christians treated better by Hamas than they are by Israel? I realize that question is really loaded. There's probably a lot of nuance here, and I'm sorry if it feels like a question that is not properly nuanced. I don't know how better to ask the question. And now I'm hoping for some guidance, because Palestinian Christians in the Gaza Strip are living alongside Hamas, right? Mm-hmm. And so now we have this war where Israel has come in, and this is just somewhat indiscriminate. Tell me about the daily life of a Palestinian Christian in the Gaza Strip, if you can.
Yeah, thanks for that. I don't have a lot of insight about that because I'm not from the Gaza Strip. Actually, hey, if I can do some shameless promotion, I just launched a podcast with some friends. It's called Across the Divide. We just launched it like 2 days ago, and the first episode is actually with a Christian from the Gaza Strip. So if people from the podcast want to kind of listen to what Palestinian Christians from Gaza are saying, I highly recommend the first episode. We met with a Christian theologian from Gaza. His name is Yusuf Al-Khoury. So it's on the podcast, the first episode, Across the Divide podcast. So sorry for that, but he
Check
shares
the show notes, listeners. I will find that, and there'll be a link in the show notes.
Thank you, Matthew. So he has more of an insight than I do. I've only been to Gaza a few times, only as a kid with my family a few times, and then most recently in 2020, just before the pandemic hit, like in January 2020, like it hit in like February or March. But so I got to go there and kind of see Gaza. I spent like 5 days there, and that's when I was coaching and training coaches on how to coach ultimate frisbee in the Gaza Strip. And from what
you didn't have any hesitation about going. It sounds like. I mean, it sounds like you were fine.
Well, yes. No, yeah, for sure. Palestinians are united, and like this is like we Palestinians see ourselves as one people. The political reality is a bit complicated, and how Israel was able to successfully divide and conquer Palestinians, creating these different political and geographical systems that isolate us from each other. For example, the Palestinians in the Gaza separate from those in the West Bank, and those in East Jerusalem, which is also part of the West Bank, but they have a different legal status. And then you have the Palestinian citizens of Israel. It's a different, also political, civil like case. And then you have the refugees, and you have the Palestinians in diaspora. And each people group, all of them are Palestinians, but they're kind of ruled by different systems of control and dominations and so on. But it's for me, it's actually impossible for me from the West Bank. I'm from the West Bank, like I said, I think, from Bethlehem in the West Bank. Impossible for me to go to Gaza, actually, like just to go and visit people. And we can talk about what Gaza looks like, especially because of the blockade for the last 16 years. But I was able to make it into Gaza through a German sports development organization called the GIZ. And they basically petitioned the Israeli government to give me a permit to enter into the Gaza Strip as an expert and a professional. But like I couldn't just go on my own. I had to get, ironically, a German organization to get me to go see my fellow countrymen. But Andrew, I cannot talk about a specific experience for Palestinian Christians in Gaza vis-a-vis Muslim Palestinians in Gaza. From what I understand, it's fairly similar. There's nothing that is unique. Like there's no persecution or kind of harassment of them being Christians. Palestinian Christians in general are faring fairly well under the Palestinian government or Palestinian control, whether it's in the West Bank, ruled by the Palestinian Authority, led by the party of Fatah, which is where that's the party of the president, or the Christians in the Gaza Strip, ruled by the political party of Hamas, the political arm of Hamas. Hamas is, as a political organization, is conservative. So it's not conservative in the stereotypical conservative like government as you would see like in Egypt, or I don't want to say Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is way more conservative and more fundamentalist, but it's a very conservative government and believes strongly in adhering to Islam and the regulations and purity laws and decency, clothing, and so on. But like there's no specific like targeting of Christians actually for the Palestinian authorities, whether Hamas or the official PA. They kind of made it very clear that the Palestinian prosperity, as Palestinian Christian prosperity and well-being, is important for the Palestinian population, because we're a small minority, and our positioning is important for the Palestinians as a political system, that the Palestinians are protected and doing fairly well, and Palestinian Christians tend to fare really well. Whether it's economically, whether it's because of connections with the West and support from churches in the West, and like the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches, Lutheran, Anglican. So it's like our impact in society is actually oversized for our numbers. And when specifically about Gaza, we're talking about 700 Christians in Gaza. So it's a very small population. A lot of them have been able to escape and leave since the blockade. With like some kind of working with some kind of rules about family reunification and so on. And But it has always been a small population. I think there used to be like around 2,000 Christians, 3 small churches. But since the blockade, a lot of them have escaped. But those who remain and continue to remain, are now numbered down to like 700-800. I don't think they would reach 1,000 right now, but thereabouts, 700-800 Christians. There's Orthodox, and you have Catholics, and you have also a Baptist church in the Gaza Strip. It is just a conservative Muslim government. I cannot talk about anything specific that they would deal with, but if I can just pivot from your question, Andrew, to talk about the reality on the ground, which is important for us if you want to understand Hamas and the attacks. Gazans have been under a very brutal blockade of the Gaza Strip since 2007 when Hamas came to power. Palestinians had elections in 2005. That was the last time we had elections. And Palestinians overwhelmingly, at least in the parliamentarian elections, not overwhelmingly to be accurate, but Hamas members won the majority of the parliament. And this caused a huge problem for Hamas, for Israel and the US, and they basically lobbied, and we have declassified documents showing this, that Israel and the US pushed the Fatah party, the Palestinian government, to basically oust Hamas out of the government. The PA lost its power basically because of democracy. Israel and the US did not want democracy for the Palestinians if the outcome of such democracy is actually losing power to Hamas. And basically Hamas was ousted from the government in the West Bank and then pushed into the Gaza Strip. And then since then, Israel has enacted a brutal blockade on the Gaza Strip. It's been labeled as the world's largest open-air prison, just complete blockade of a very small area. I think it's like a 360 square kilometers, very tiny area. I think for Americans, it's like 160 square miles or thereabouts. Prison, the open-air prison, even though it's helpful to think about, it's not even accurate. I prefer calling it a concentration camp, because prison implies that everyone is guilty and they deserve to be in prison. The only crime of the Palestinians of Gaza is that they were born in Gaza. That's the only crime while they're in the blockade. The situation has, since the blockade, Israel has controlled the entry and exits of everywhere in the strip. Poverty is at staggering numbers, like 60 or 70% of Gazans are under the poverty line. 50% are unemployed. Israel adopted this kind of eyedropper system where it controls the amount of water, electricity, food, calories, how many calories are permitted into the Gaza Strip. It's one of the most densely populated areas in the world. As well. Again, I've been in touch with a lot of kind of my friends in Gaza, and like the stories I've been hearing about their life and the kind of the struggles are just kind of horrifying. And by 2020, the UN came out with a report saying that by the year 2020, Gaza Strip is uninhabitable. Just the decimation of the infrastructure, no clean water, 3-4 hours of electricity a day, very densely populated, very limited resources, no economic opportunities, no ability of movement, to travel, to leave the Gaza Strip. It's a very horrendous kind of reality, which I don't know if what Israel was thinking, but it basically became fertile ground for a rise of frustration and anger, and which gives for some Palestinians a justification for Hamas and Hamas militancy. And we can talk about Hamas later. And I also want to point this out. In the last 16 years since the blockade, Israel has waged 5 wars on the Gaza Strip in 2008 and 12 and 14 and 16 and 18 and 21. And every time, hundreds of Palestinians are killed. In 2014, thousands of Palestinians were killed, mostly also kids and women. That's not really different. If you're a Hamas member now, if you're a Palestinian in Gaza, you have gone, and especially you're young. By the way, 50% of the population of Gaza is under 18. Why? Because the living conditions are so horrible. The life expectancy, or the average life expectancy, is so low that 50% of the population is under 18. That's how abysmal the situation, the economic, political, health situation in Gaza. There's a lot to say about the medical conditions and high rates of cancer and so on and so forth, and also limitations on treatment, ability to leave the Gaza Strip. The hospitals in the Gaza Strip do not have access to the technologies and machines and so on because Israel bans these. A lot of Gazans die from preventable diseases just because they don't have access to the medicine or the machines or the treatments and so on. So if you are a Gazan, if you're like in your 20s, you've gone through wars, these like airstrikes from Israel and bombing. You've lost someone, you've lost a family member, you've lost a cousin, a nephew, a father, a daughter. And that's very real for a lot of the Gazans. It's a very hard reality to be in a jail, to be in this concentration camp and being bombed every 3 or 4 years. That provides Hamas becomes important. Like they are the ones who are standing up to Israeli attacks, to the oppression, and so on and so forth. And if you are in your 20s, you lost so many of your family members. You've lost hope in life, and there's a sense of despair and hopelessness that exists there that is none of us have experienced, and we don't even know what that is like.
So let me tell you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Well, this is incredibly interesting because so this is actually what I was after. What is the daily life of anyone in Gaza like? Right. And all of this. So I read your open letter right before the show. Well, not your open letter, but the open letter that you participated in, right? So
sure.
That open letter has a number of signatories, right? And there'll be a link in the show notes to the open letter.
Okay.
And so from here, I want to take a moment, Matthew, if it's okay with you,
Go for it.
and reflect back beyond the 19th, before the 19th, okay, before Israel attack, okay, and talk with us for a moment, mostly meaning you talk and we'll listen, but talk with us for a moment about the buildup to the 17th, to the what the U.S. and Western countries broadly paint as the air, sea, and land attack on Israel, right? Because that is. In the news cycle, that's where this starts, right? This is a war prosecuted by Hamas that started on the 17th, and already I get that there's so much history here that I now can't see the 17th as the start. Right, but can you talk a little more about why the 17th?
Yeah, to be accurate, Andrew, it was October 7th, not the 17th.
I'm sorry. Right.
Yeah, you're fine.
Thank you, and I appreciate the.
You got it. Yeah, I mean that's an important question, Andrew, and that's what the West do not want to reckon with. And things do not happen. Violence does not happen in a vacuum. And there's always, we need to understand context, and we need to understand history. I try to give you an image of the context of the reality in Gaza, but also it's the context of Palestinian life in general, not just in the Gaza Strip. It's a context of military occupation and oppression. We can, if you want, we can go to the history, and starting from 1917 and the Balfour Declaration, where the British Empire promised European Jews a homeland in Palestine, and how that led eventually through imperial colonial powers to push the Palestinians out and create the state of Israel, really at the expense of the Palestinians and over the lands and the homes of the Palestinians. And that led to a catastrophe that is called in Arabic the Nakba, or the catastrophe of 1948, what Israel calls the War of Independence, by which 700,000 Palestinians, the majority of the time, were pushed out of their lands, made into refugees, and thereby creating the state of Israel over the lands of the Palestinians. So when we talk about two-state solution and so on, we're talking about giving Palestinians 22% of the land, of their own land, right? 1/5 of the land, and Israel maintains its control over 78% of historic Palestine. So if you just kind of look up the maps of Palestine and so on, you can see what that looks like and kind of the gradual loss of land. To connect it back to Hamas and Gaza, 70% of the population of Gaza are refugees. So these are 3 generations or more of Palestinians who are not from Gaza. They are actually from Israeli cities like, well, they are called today Israeli cities like Haifa and Jaffa and so on. The Christian theologian from Gaza we met with at our podcast, his family is from Jaffa or Jaffa. So this is like today considered an Israeli city, but his family is actually from Jaffa, which is north of the Gaza Strip. Because of the war of 1947 and 48 and 49, they kind of basically escaped the war, just like Ukrainians did, just like Syrians and Iraqis did, 10 years ago or so. They went down south away, and we can talk about what the Jewish militias were doing at the time. But then they got stuck in the Gaza Strip. They found refuge there, and then still have not been able to go back. Israel would not give them the right, what we call the right of return. But there's a lot to unpack when it comes to the history of colonization, dispossession, disenfranchisement of Palestinians, and the ongoing Nakba, the ongoing catastrophe. It's not that Palestinians have only been pushed out of their land and in 48, and they continue to be ethnically cleansed and pushed out of their communities, whether in the Hebron Hills, in the West Bank, in the Negev. You have the Bedouin communities there, Palestinians, Christians, and Muslims in East Jerusalem, where Israel has adopted this Judaizing policy of pushing the Palestinians, the Arabs, out and instead implant Jewish settlers into their homes and neighborhoods. Can talk about harassments against Palestinian citizens of Israel in the north and so on, where Israel is trying to maximize its power if its control of the Palestinians, and then render the Palestinians as inconvenient pockets of non-Jews living in certain areas, or at best for them is to be completely finished and pushed out of the land. We're 700,000 refugees of 48 now are 5 million refugees who are stuck in refugee camps, most of them at least, who have a right to return per the international resolutions, but are still denied entry back to their home. Just like saying the Ukrainians who escaped the war today or in the last 2 years, the war is over and they're still stuck in camps and they cannot go back to their home country, even though they have a legal right to go back. So that's the context. And before October 7th, Andrew, in the West Bank, just in the West Bank, we can talk, just this year in the West Bank, I think around 300 Palestinians were killed, mostly children as well, including, mostly innocents. 37 of the 300 were children, and a few women as well, and elderly. And there was no outcry about it. Like you do not think up to invite me to a podcast, neither did Tim Whitaker for the New Evangelicals, but we're talking about 300 Palestinians and 37 children in the West Bank. But we don't talk, they don't make it to the news. They're not significant. But if they were Jewish, if they were Israelis, there would be like an outcry about them. But anyway, 300 Palestinians killed. I don't know if you heard about the pogrom that was done in Hawara, settler violence and settler gangs going through the West Bank and burning trees and burning cars and homes and shooting Palestinians in the West Bank. Harassments in the Temple Mount, in the Aqsa Mosque, where the military would go and shoot and arrest Palestinians praying in the mosque. And that's been ongoing all of this year before October 7th, but no one paid attention to the Palestinians.
That's what I wanted. There's these things always have a history.
Right. But also, Andrew, I just want to, sorry to interrupt you.
No, please.
The whole situation in Palestine and what Palestinians call Palestine. We're not talking about the West Bank or Gaza Strip, the whole historic Palestine. If you look at the map of historic Palestine, the whole situation has been described by Palestinians themselves, the Palestinian legal theorists and lawyers, and by Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem, and by Amnesty International in 2022, and by Human Rights Watch, and by the UN, has been described as a system of apartheid, a system that is of Jewish supremacy against the Palestinian population. I'm not making this up. Just look up Amnesty International apartheid or Human Rights Watch apartheid, and you can read the reports. It's a system of one people group that controls other people group. The one people group that mostly comes from Europe, from Russia, Germany, Poland, New York, Brooklyn, that comes here and has this kind of supremacy, Jewish supremacy, against myself or Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, the indigenous population of the land. So this is a situation of Jewish supremacy and apartheid and settler colonialism, where you colonize the people, their land, their buildings through the settler movement. So that is the context of oppression. It did not begin on October 7th, Andrew. It's begun in 1948 actually, but it was also, just to go after Matthew here, began in 1917 with the British Empire that took over Palestine in the, I don't know if you know about this, Matthew, I'm sure, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where the French and the British went into the Middle East and they draw these arbitrary lines to divide Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and created that situation of like, this is not how we choose how to divide our land, but then created the system. And then Lord Balfour, the prime minister of the time, because of European Jewish lobbying, he sent his famous letter, the declaration, the Balfour Declaration. And if you look this up, like, who is this letter sent to? To Rothschild, Lord Rothschild, one of the wealthiest and more influential kind of Jewish family in Europe. And he says, we, the British Empire, look favorably to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And there's a lot to unpack to say about colonialism, but it began in 1917, continued with the eviction of the Palestinians, the majority of the Palestinians from their land in 47 and 48. Ilan Pappé, I guess we can also include this in the show notes, an Israeli historian wrote the book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, and he documents the works with declassified documents from the Israeli government, from the military, and documents this very intentional military campaign to drive the Palestinians out of their homeland, of their homes and villages and towns, in order to create a Jewish majority. So you had colonial powers, you had ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in 47 and 48, and you have continual occupation and Jewish domination of the indigenous populations that has been adequately described as an apartheid. And that has been happening for the last 75 years. And that is the context of everything that is happening. And we cannot make sense of Hamas and Palestinian resistance and Palestinian trauma and pain and tragedy if you do not give them the benefit of that, give them the benefit of history and the benefit of context. And then we can then start unpacking why is Hamas doing this and what for, and what do Palestinians think and so forth. But only if we understand this in terms of suffering and tragedy and trauma and oppression, none of this could make sense to anyone, I think.
So do the general population, and I'm assuming the older, those who are still alive, do they still have the narrative of this British mistreatment of the people?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's all your fault, guys. Like, it's all your fault.
Yeah,
we.
It is, and I say this as a person with a British passport. What we did in Africa, what we did in India and Pakistan. What we've done everywhere where we've gone into the world and lived for generations and exported our white-skinned people. We've done atrocities, and I think too many British people are too embarrassed or ashamed to admit that. But we did it. We fucked up part of the world, much of it badly.
Yeah, no, what's her name? The Prime Minister before Boris Johnson. I forgot her name now.
Theresa May.
Theresa May, and in 1917, when she was the prime minister, she was asked, like, what do you think about, like, there have been calls for the British government to apologize for 1917 and the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, and she boasted, like, she was like, this is one of the proudest moments for me as a Brit to celebrate the Balfour Declaration. So Britain doesn't play a significant role right now in the conflict. I mean, this is like mostly the US's kind of role here, but Britain has not apologized, has not made any kind of effort to rectify what it did or apologize for what happened in 48. For the last 105 years, 6 years really. An excellent book here, Matthew, for us for the audience to work for or like read is a book by a Palestinian American historian, Rashid Khalidi. It's called The 100 Years War on Palestine. I guess you put it in the show notes, but it's like documents this this process of this war that began with the colonial interests of Jewish Zionists, and then facilitated by the British Empire, and then leading to where we are today. So Rashid Khalidi, 100 Years War on Palestine, is an excellent book that documents all of this history that I've kind of been sharing about.
Daniel, I went back to October 7th for the purpose of pointing out that this was not an original act of war.
Right.
And so in case you're wondering why I went back there, it is because this conflict goes much further back. And the news cycle has a tendency to forget a war that's, if it's a couple years old, it's ancient past, right? And so the reason for going back to the 7th was to point out that this conflict, this war didn't start on October 7th, and there's history beyond the news cycle. And so thank you for just walking through what got us there, because I think it's important for this conversation.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Andrew.
Matthew, I've got a lot to think about, so I'm going to let you ask the next question.
Yeah. So let's stay within what you've just been talking about then, about what the British did when they were relinquishing their control of that region, and they created those artificial boundaries and those borders. And I don't know enough about what the British were trying to achieve when they did what they did. I am aware that there was desire from the Jews. Okay, I'm going post 17 now. I'm going to late 40s, post World War II. With the atrocities that happened to the Jews in Europe, they wanted a place to live, and they wanted what they saw as their historic homeland. So I understand that. What I don't understand is how the Palestinians felt, how they were treated, because you mentioned before they were foisted out of what there was at that point in time their homeland, to create a new homeland for some other people who lived there before. But the borders had changed, the populations had changed, etc. So I understand that there's a sense of a grievance there. That's perfectly understandable. I get that. But how do we get from that grievance to the kind of atrocities that we're going now? Because when I look at that map now and Israel and its neighbors, my perspective from an outside looking on is everybody seems to hate Israel. But when I also look at it, though, at that point in time in the late 40s, were Israel really the people that deserved it at that point? Because it wasn't Israel that moved in, it was the British that moved them in. The British are clearly responsible, along with some of their allies, for what went on there, for the creation of the state there, the borders that were created there, who moved to where. Why aren't the British hated as much, or are they?
No, actually, they're not. I mean, they are complicit. I mean, they have begun this, but this is a historical sin that we haven't. Like right now, what Palestinians want is justice and peace, and equality and human rights, and for UN laws. Like it's a very basic, it's a very basic request, very minimal demands here, of granting Palestinians self-determination and freedom, and implementation of UN resolutions. Like we're not asking for much. It's like asking for our humanity to be guaranteed and protected, and that we can live freely and sovereignly, just like any other people group, just like any other country in the world. And that is guaranteed to us by law. And the Palestine as a state is recognized by scores of countries around the world. It's a non-member state of the UN, waiting basically the final resolution, basically the end of the occupation over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and the restoration of the Palestinian freedom.
Right in that space, talk for a moment because when we talk about sovereignty, of course, that's something that Israel talks about as well, right?
Sure.
So talk for a moment about a two-state solution, because that will require some drawing lines on maps, or barring that, some other sharing of land, right?
Mm-hmm.
So talk about what sovereignty looks like for Palestine from your view, and you're obviously well connected to the whole community.
Right.
So talk about sovereignty, because it's a big idea.
Again, let's do some history first. So Palestinians after 48, after the Nakba, after the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, refused all of this, saying we're not okay with giving up our land. And there was like this, propagandists for Israel they keep bringing up, the partition plan of 1948, 47, Palestinians rejected to split the land with the Israelis, with the Jews. It's so your fault for rejecting that. You should have accepted that deal. Palestinians, and principally, they said, well, why would we give up half of our land to these European migrants? Like, that doesn't make sense, especially if it's been forced on us by the colonial powers, by the British and the French and so on. Imagine like someone comes to your property and is like, hey, can I rent like a corner in your backyard? Like I've been attacked and hurt, and can I just rent from you, or can I buy a small plot of land from you? It's like, okay, and you're being magnanimous and like generous, and it's like, and you would tell him, yeah, okay, yeah, go ahead, you can pay me, you don't have to pay me, whatever. But then like a few years later, he would bring some like big guns and like big people and big influential folks, and they would say, well, what, actually you need to give him half of your land and your living room and your kitchen and your bathroom, and maybe you can stay in the basement. And so, I don't think you would be okay with that, Andrew or Matthew. And like Palestinians are like, no, we're not going to give you our land. This is where we grew up, and this is where our history and our folklore and our homes are, where we wrote our books and sang our songs. We're not going to give you this. And we saw in Palestinians, two things were happening. First, they knew what the Zionist thinkers were saying, and by the 30s and the 20s and the 30s, writings of people like Herzl, the founder of Zionism, Jabotinsky, a well-known kind of Zionist thinker at the time, they made it into Arabic, and Palestinians were reading the writings, and they were very explicit. Jabotinsky, in his essay "The Iron Wall," he talks about our mission to colonize Palestine. The goal of Zionism from the beginning was colonization. And the Palestinians were like, no, we're not going to give you that. And then 48 was happened, and they won the war in 48. The Palestinians were mostly kicked out, and Palestinians were united. We're going to keep fighting until we get our land back, just like the Indians, just like the Africans, just like any other people group that were controlled, going back to the British Empire, controlled by the empire. We had that kind of sense of this kind of global solidarity and resistance against colonialism. And Palestinians thought that they can do it. Now, long story short, Palestinian Liberation Organization was formed eventually. And by the 80s, the head of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, and the PLO in general, as the sole representative of the Palestinians, basically were subdued into accepting the two-state solution. To get to your question, Andrew, where they were saying, we don't want Palestine, all of it anymore. We're happy, we're content to have the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem as our capital. So a sacrifice, a big compromise from 100% of the land to saying, just give us, please, 22% of the land. Just give us 1/5 of the land. We're happy with it. And we want to be a sovereign people. So like we can control our borders, we control our infrastructure, control our air, and so on and so forth. And that was famously, you guys might remember this, in 1993, the Oslo Agreement, the famous picture between Yasser Arafat, Ishaq Rabin, the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, and kind of Bill Clinton in the middle. And that was kind of the beginning of the peace process by which at the year 2000, Israel would pull out of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and give Palestinians their state. Eventually negotiations failed. Palestinians basically were duped into, because this touches on your question, Andrew, about sovereignty, where basically Israel was telling Palestinians, hey, you can control your own space in the West Bank, but we're going to basically we're gonna have control over some kind of important areas, like where like important aquifers in the western part of the West Bank are. So like we want to maintain control there. We need to control the borders of the West Bank. So like if you leave the Palestinian state, you have to go through Israeli security and complete control over the airspace. So you don't have a Palestinian airspace. So if you look at the Taba agreements or the Camp David negotiations in 98 and so on 99, you can see, and you can read the reports, like basically giving Palestinians civil society and like and kind of self-rule, but without any sovereignty, without any autonomy, without any ability to have a military to defend yourself or any kind of real sense of sovereignty and self-determination. It was basically a Bantustan system, or like an official state that has no guarantees or no protections or no basic foundations for a political entity as a Palestinian state. And Palestinians rejected that. And since then, we're still waiting for the end of the occupation. And for the Palestinians, we're not fighting for historic Palestine anymore. Like, that's not the cause right now. The issue is end the occupation and grant Palestinians their freedom back. I mean, that's the basic kind of request from the Palestinians.
Am I right in assuming that 22% of Palestine that you got whenever it was when that treaty was signed, presumably the amount of land that the Palestinians live on now is not 22%. I'm assuming it's quite a lot smaller than that now.
Right. So yeah, the West Bank and Gaza Strip are 22% of historic Palestine. So Palestine, Israel in total, we're asking for the 1/5 of that. Right now, effectively, Palestinians have control over I think 40% of the West Bank. So these are like the main cities. So like I'm from the city of Bethlehem. The PA has control there. The PA has some control in like Ramallah, in Hebron, in Nablus, Jenin, kind of these main cities and kind of surrounding villages. But 60% of the West Bank is controlled by the Israeli military. So like if you just look up map of the West Bank and look up areas A and B and C, there's this is maybe like too much for the audience, but Israel divides the West Bank into 3 areas. Area A, where the Palestinian government has control, and that's like the minority, and area B, where the Palestinian government maintains some kind of civil control, but the security is in the hands of Israel. And then area C, which is the majority of the West Bank, is controlled by the military, the Israeli military, for the Palestinians, a foreign military. Think of like a Russian occupation of like some regions in Ukraine. And that's where they have their bases. That's where they have their settlements. Around 700,000 Jewish settlers live in the West Bank, which is against international law. It's against the Geneva Conventions. You are not allowed to transfer your population into occupied territory. And by doing so intentionally, and this has been happening consistently since 1967, by doing so, basically killing the two-state solution. Because now you have, and you can look up like what the settlements look like in the West Bank, and it's insane. Like it's now for the Palestinians to think about two-state solution, Matthew, doesn't make sense. Like just look at the map. You have big, they call them settlements or colonies. We call them colonies. Israelis call it settlements, or that's kind of the international lingo. But these are like massive cities with like hundreds and thousands of people living in them. And there's some like there's some tiny ones. There's some kind of like small farming communities and villages, but like some of them are huge cities. And that's kind of also the context of like, so when Hamas go into October 7th, not to justify the heinous crimes and what they did to the Israelis. I don't want anyone to think I'm trying to like excuse them.
No, I don't.
But they're saying we're doing this in response to the settler violence, in response to the settlements, and in response to Israel having kidnapped 5,000 Palestinians. So I don't know if you're following the news right now. They're talking about the prisoner swap. So Hamas's reasoning is like, let's go, like, putting aside international law, we're not going to pay attention to this. Let's kidnap some Israeli civilians, just like the Israeli military kidnaps Palestinian civilians. We're talking about 5,000 Palestinian prisoners, children, women, men, are taken into jail from a foreign government. Imagine like I don't know, Matthew, like France, the military of France comes to Britain. This is not a fair comparison, but they come and kidnap people without due process. The Britain government cannot protect you, Matthew. They come and kidnap you and put you in jail. Some of the Palestinians, this is called in the Israeli lingo, administrative detention. They take the Palestinian, put him in jail for 6 months without due process. He's just detained for administrative purposes. And so Hamas is saying, you have 5,000 Palestinians kidnapped without due process, with a rigged political system. We're going to kidnap 200 people. And I don't know if this makes it to the news. And basically they're saying, we don't want to kill anyone. We want to release our prisoners. So we'll give you the 200 Israeli citizens if you give us back the 5,000 Palestinian kidnapped Palestinians. So for the Palestinians, these are not prisoners, these are hostages controlled by the Israeli military. And that's kind of the reasoning for kind of how Hamas kind of makes sense of what they're doing. Of course, crimes were committed, heinous attacks on civilians, and that's not excusable, but that's kind of the military tactic, or the justification, at least, they used for their attacks on Israel. And again, to finish answering the question from Andrew, that is kind of the system that exists there. There's no sense of sovereignty, there's no sense of freedom. Israel can do whatever they want. They control the majority of the West Bank. Like I said, a concentration in the Gaza Strip, lack of any political hope, any emotional hope, or any kind of sense of, things are going to get better. Nothing is getting better for the Palestinians. And that's been the case since the beginning of the whole conflict. And that leads, sadly, to the attacks that happened on October 7th.
So I'm reading between the lines from what you've said and some of the things that you've said. From that point, that 1993, I think it was, you said, with Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin and that famous handshake. And I remember that. I am old enough just about to remember that. My memory of that was it was a big thing in the news. The Western press celebrated that. This was going to be a great moment towards peace, a bit like the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. It was supposed to bring in a new era of peace. But it feels from what you've said that actually there was distrust, that the Palestinian people felt that they didn't actually get a fair deal in that, and that they've not trusted Israel ever since.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, why would you trust your colonizer? Why would you trust your enemy? Why would you trust the person who ethnically cleansed their people, stuck in refugee camps? When I talk about refugee camps, I'm literally talking about camps. 2 days ago, the Jabalia refugee camp was attacked in Gaza. So these are refugees living in a refugee camp. It's not like a camp in the sense of tents anymore. It's been 75 years. But these are people who lost their homes and their means of income, their livelihood, everything, and they're stuck in refugee camps. Why would you trust the person who did this to you? Why would you trust the person who has been victimizing you, shooting you left and right? The footage coming from the West Bank these days, we're not hearing about the West Bank, just trigger happy killings of Palestinians. Anyone, I saw footage yesterday of an old grandpa on a stick. He was walking at 6 a.m., I think, leaving the mosque after praying. He was walking with a stick, and he was shot and killed on the spot. A kid yesterday was throwing stones at Israeli soldiers so far away from the soldiers, throwing stones far away, that he was sniped and killed on the spot. How can you trust the person who and if you look at the numbers of Palestinians killed, not to I don't want to play this game of quantifying suffering, but look at the numbers of Palestinians killed. Look at the numbers of children killed in the last 20 years. There's no comparison, but in suffering, and and Israel is pitted at this, what's the term they give Israel as, this startup country. All this kind of money from wealthy European Jews and supporters and Christians in the West, which are don't get me started on Christians from the West. This kind of bring in all this money and bring in all this prosperity, and Israel is there's this kind of whitewashing, this great country of democracy and freedom. Biden and the West, they say, well, this is a democracy, a liberal democracy. We need to support democracies. Democracies support democracies. But all of that is happening. It's called a democracy insofar it is happening at the expense of the Palestinians, who are occupied and oppressed and killed and harassed and controlled, and their movement is controlled and their infrastructure is controlled and no access to their water. They and so on and so forth. And there's a lot to say. Like every aspect of life, every aspect of Palestinian life in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip is controlled by the Israeli government, by a government that we did not vote for. So like whenever people say, oh, this is a democracy, it's not a democracy. It's a democracy for its citizens. But they control the lives of 7 million Palestinians who did not vote for that government, did not vote for that military to come on. And that's kind of the issue here, that there's no hope. There's entrenched oppression and racism and no democracy for the Palestinians.
Okay. So having said that then, what control do Hamas actually have in the area when they were voted into power?
All right, so they won the elections in 2005 in the parliament. By then, the PLO was seen as corrupt, and we have a lot to say about our government. I mean, it's a corrupt government that doesn't have any mandate from the people. It's put in power by Israel and by the U.S. The legitimacy they get is from Israel and not from the Palestinian people. They promised us a two-state solution, and they gave us nothing. And
so the choice then was a puppet government controlled by Israel, or
a resistance movement, what they call. So Hamas is it's an acronym. Hamas stands for the Islamic Liberation Movement. So that statement, that phrase in Arabic, and is given the acronym Hamas.
Okay. So given this scenario then where
so
given the historical distrust of Israel, and you've got these two choices, why is anybody surprised that Hamas got the most votes?
Right, exactly. So when you have a corrupt government, that is basically their job right now is to basically, we call them the contractors of Israel. Like Israel contracts the Palestinian government to basically run the Palestinian populations in the West Bank.
Okay.
And they got so much funding from the US, and they got support from Israel and security coordination with Israel, and the Palestinian and they normalized, as the subcontractors of Israel, they normalized the oppression. There's no sovereignty, there's no freedom, there's no justice. But hey, we'll collect taxes and we'll register your houses, or whatever, like the civil society kind of, civil government kind of they have. But then comes to the scene Hamas, who, uses religious language of anti-corruption, of purity, of following faith and being righteous and rejecting the enemy and fighting the enemy. And the Palestinians, who do not have to have any sympathy to Hamas or militancy, they're saying, well, it's between this corrupt person or this person who's promising to be a good leader. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna give Hamas a shot. So now this happened in 2005, and we still trusted the PLO to have the president, so we did not choose a Hamas leader. But on the grassroots level, and in villages and towns, if you compare Fatah members, the PLO, and the people who came out from Hamas, are saying, well, no, Hamas makes sense now to us. And Hamas continued and has made a very kind of clear position that we are not collaborators. We're not owned, we're not bought by the West and by the US and by Israel, and we're going to fight for the Palestinian freedom, and we're going to resist. And Hamas as a movement believes in armed struggle, just like the ANC in South Africa, just like a lot of groups in India and in Africa who says we have been victimized by a military, and we have the right, fighting against this military entity, to armed struggle. And this is, armed struggle for occupied people is actually guaranteed and protected as a right. If you're oppressed, you have the right to armed struggle, especially if you're oppressed by a foreign military government or entity that you did not choose for yourself. And so Hamas, and also generally speaking, Palestinians see Israel as a colonial imposition, as the Europeans from Ukraine And I don't know, Bibi Netanyahu is, I think, from Poland or something, like the prime minister, his family. Like, we see these as like foreigners who came into our land, escaping persecution. Palestinians have a hard time like empathizing with Jewish Europeans just because of their own trauma and hurt. But anyway, like, these people escaped persecution. The victimized became our victimizer. Palestinians are paying for the sins of the Christians in the West, of their anti-Semitism. They push the Jews out. The Jews were fed up with anti-Semitism. We're going to leave. But then the oppressed becomes the oppressor. They oppress us because they want to have their own homeland. And so Palestinians are like, no, all of this is colonialism. All of this is oppression, and we reject it. And then Hamas comes to the scene and like, hey, we'll do that for you. We'll free you. We're going to fight. We're going to have our own rockets. And we don't have the tanks or the nuclear bombs that Israel has, but we're going to fight. We're committed to fighting the armed struggle against Israel. And so some Palestinians were like, yeah, that's great. Like, we believe, like, we want to fight, and because we want to fight for our freedom. And anyone who is oppressed, we should not be surprised. I think this might be difficult for you guys, as you know, in the West. But if you're oppressed and you've been oppressed for a long time, just like any people group, whether it's Americans in the independence war, you know, rejecting paying taxes to the King of Britain, or, you know, the black South Africans, or, you know, African Americans against, you know, the discrimination and slavery and so on. Like, this is. And you can see examples of the formations of militias and militancy by oppressed people groups from all of, you know, human history. Speaking of militias, Andrew can relate to this. There's this Second Amendment in the Constitution that guarantees Americans.
About to talk about that. Yeah.
Right.
The very formation. Sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, I mean, you would know the wording of the Second Amendment, but basically that the right to bear arms and form militias should not be denied to the American. That you have the right to bear arms. And why? If you ask a Second Amendment American, why do you want to own a gun? Now, in the language of the amendment is to form militias. But for them, this is how they protect themselves from the tyranny of the government. That's how they can make sure that the government remains free, and so no one can come and take their land from them or their house from them. They have a gun to protect themselves. So that's how for many Americans, which is, you know, most Americans, I think, agree with the Second Amendment. They agree on the limits of, you know, what kind of weapons you can have, but they agree on the concept that you have the right to self-defense using weapons. And in many respects, I don't know if this is accurate, Andrew, what I'm saying here, but many respects for the Palestinians, we have a right to formulate militias and defend ourselves from the actual, literal 75 years of oppression, a tyranny of a foreign government on our land. So in this context, if any of what I'm saying to you in the last hour and so makes sense, if this is what leads to Hamas, right? People who are saying we're fed up and we're going to use militia tactics, guerrilla tactics, and defend our dignity and our freedom.
Can I just do a quick time check? So I've got two questions that I want to ask, which might take a few minutes. Are you okay for time at the moment?
Right, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, sure.
Andrew, have you got any questions at the moment?
No, I was just going to say, Daniel, that paragraph on the Second Amendment. The reason we have 400 million guns and 350 million people in the United States is not because of oppression, but because of the very idea that oppression could occur.
Right.
And so, yeah, you were spot on. And that was all, Matthew, please.
Okay. Right, yeah, and 75 years of oppression. What do you expect? What do you expect? Yeah. Also, I have to keep saying this because me trying to give the audience and you guys an understanding of the context is in no way, please do not misread me. I'm not justifying. As a Palestinian and many like me, we reject violence. We reject warfare. We reject Hamas and their tactics. We don't think this is how you can beat Israel in warfare. We cannot beat the strongest military in the Middle East. That's not how we beat them. And Palestinians, officially and largely adopted a nonviolent resistance approach. Even our government has adopted this diplomatic approach to put pressure on Israel through the ICC, the International Criminal Court, the ICJ, and through the UN. And we maintain that kind of moral high ground. But at the same time, not condoning, again, violence and militancy makes sense for many Palestinians in this context. That's what I'm saying. Now,
if you treat people like dogs, they're going to bite you.
Exactly. If you have, if the example that we bring up is the example of the neck and the boot. If you have a boot on my neck for 75 years, I can ask you politely, remove your boot, but like at some point I'm going to try to reach for a knife and stab you in the foot, and that's gonna what happens here. And I think victimized people, if you're in Gaza, if you're 20 years old and you have gone through 5 wars, you probably lost a dad or a sister or a wife. Why wouldn't you join Hamas? Why wouldn't you want to pick up a gun? It just why, like, do you have any hope for peace, for like justice, for like, is anyone gonna avenge your wife? Like, is there any kind of due process where the soldier who killed your wife in an airstrike is gonna go to court or put in jail? No. So what do you do? And I mean, thank God I was never in that position. And but most Palestinians do not have the luxuries that I have, or the luxuries that you guys have in the West, where you live in these democracies and where everyone is supposedly, at least, treated equally under the law and there's due process. But that's not a right that is given to Palestinians, and it's been 75 years of this.
Okay. I wanted to make a note over something that you said a while back. You talked about something like 60% of the people in the Gaza Strip living in poverty. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to point out to the still unbelievable listeners who are broadly from the Western world, when you're talking about poverty, Daniel, that's a reflection on poverty from something like the UN standard or from the World Health Organization. We're not talking about poverty from a Western country perspective. So I just wanted to put that note in for listeners. They ought to do a little research on what the international poverty line is to understand that this is poverty that is hard to imagine listening to a podcast. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, in Britain, poverty is you only have one television in your house and you have to buy the cheap beans rather than the expensive beans. That's not what you're talking about.
Right, no. I was talking, so I was working on, because we're going to finish soon, I would rather go to this, the questions, but I was talking before this war happened, I was talking with some of the coaches. We were going to do this kind of coaching training program, and we would pay the coaches some money for leading practices with their clubs, because their clubs do not have any fundings in Gaza. And I was asking the coach, like, how much is the daily income, like the salary you make if you work like in construction or in farming? And he's like, the daily income of a worker in Gaza is 30 shekels, which translates into $7. If you work 8 hours a day, you make you work 8 hours, you make $7. So you make less than $1 per hour. So imagine what that is like. And that's for those who actually have a job. That doesn't apply to most people. So that's how dire it is. It has been in Gaza.
Yeah. Okay. So the two questions that I've got. One is, so one of the narratives that I've seen spread about is the regime that Hamas operates there. So the narrative that I've read is Hamas runs a very fundamentalist Muslim regime, and all the children, and I literally mean all the children, are brainwashed with anti-Semitic propaganda, and that is basically what life is like growing up. What is the truth to that?
Yeah, I don't know what that is. Like, there is a discourse in the West, and that's just not it. Now, anti-Semitism. Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one. I mean, do some Palestinians espouse some anti-Semitic positions? Yes. But again, what's their context? Who is the person who killed them, who put them in refugee camps? They're Israelis. And Israel defines itself as a Jewish state. And they believe that God, because they're Jews, God gave them this land. So it's not that it's anti-Semitism akin to Western anti-Semitism, which is just born out of hatred and just nasty belligerence. a lot of it has to do with the religion and the killers of Christ and all that kind of nonsense. But so you victimize a minority in the Christian West because they disagree with you. I don't know, profit. I don't know I don't know. There's no justification for hatred of anti-Semitism, but you can make up a reason to hate people. The Palestinian hatred for Israelis is based on, like I said, on oppression and violence and so on. So like when Palestinians, if any Palestinian would say something that is anti-Jewish, they're not adopting a Western anti-Semitic discourse. They're adopting hatred. They're using a language of hatred and anger against the oppressor who happened to be Jewish. Like Israel could have been made up of Christians, and you would say hateful things about Christians, but it's not because you're a Christian I'm being hateful towards you. It's because you oppress me I'm being hateful to you. Right. Yeah. So, I mean, could you show me a video of like a Hamas person saying something that for the Western ear would be considered anti-Semitic? Yes. But I'm just telling you that this is not the Palestinian discourse. Like, that's not what the issue is. Before Israel was established, Palestinians, and you can look up the numbers of the demographics of Palestine in the 19th century, 20th century. We had a good, sizable, like a small minority of Palestinian Jews. I think up to 8 or 10% by the British census of 1922. I think the population was 10% or so. And some of them moved into Palestine because of Zionism and so on. But historically, you always had Jews living in Palestine who considered themselves Arab, like native Arabs or native Palestinians. They spoke Arabic. They were Jewish, and they had been in the land. And Palestine historically has been a very rich, and the Middle East in general, a very rich society, linguistically, culturally, politically, religiously, culturally. Like you had so many different denominations and backgrounds and ethnicities. You had the Syrians, you had the Armenians, you had the Copts, you have in Palestine today, you have the Samaritans, you have the Druze, you have the Baha'is, Christians, Muslims, and historically you had Palestinian Jews. So it was always like the relations between Jews and Muslims and Christians have been amicable for the most part in the Middle East. We can talk about some isolated instances, but it is not comparable to Christian Western anti-Semitism and pogroms in Russia or like anti-Semitism in Europe. But if a Palestinian today makes a statement that could be perceived as anti-Semitic or is anti-Semitic, he is responding to a reality that he existed in. Now, I would make a point that, and this is for the Western audience, that's not the Palestinian conversation, but I, as Daniel and myself as a Palestinian and as a Christian, I reject anti-Semitism. I reject hatred of any people group, whether you're black, whether you're queer, whether you're Jewish, doesn't matter your background. I reject that because I reject the oppression and the victimization of my people who are victimized because they're Palestinians. So my fight for the justice of Palestinians, for the freedom of Palestinians, for the dignity and the worth of Palestinian kids and women and men in Gaza right now goes hand in hand with my struggle against anti-Semitism. Because I'm driven by a pursuit, by desire for justice and for equality and for freedom for every people group. And you don't have to be, if you're anti-Israel, if you're pro-Palestine and therefore anti-Israel, you're not anti-Jewish. You're just you can say you're anti-Zionism, which for the Palestinians is just racism, is a system of domination and control by one people group over the other. But you fight for the rights and the freedoms of every person, Jews and queers and what have you, because you have a concern for justice. So these are not like, it's not like you have to be either anti-Semitic or pro-Israel. You can be pro-Palestine and also against anti-Semitism. It's the same logic that goes through all of that. I hope that makes sense.
It did, and thank you for that answer. That genuinely helps with my understanding. So my final question, because I'm aware you have to go, and I'm sorry we have to cut this conversation short now. I'm really appreciating the time that you've given to us. So to finish off then, really, is peace possible? What would you like to say to the neighbours there in Israel and Palestine? And what, in your opinion, is the best next step?
Yeah, no, yeah, it's hard to
Big
talk
question.
about peace right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not in the horizon right now. Just the stuff I'm hearing from Palestinians, the stuff, the nasty rhetoric that is coming out of Israel right now. Just yesterday, I saw a woman talking like we need to like kill them all, or there are no innocents. The only innocents in Gaza are the hostages. So every Palestinian in Gaza is a criminal, including babies and women and everyone else. And and just some of the rhetoric and the discourse by the politicians in Israel has just been so alarming. Like, if it was a Palestinian saying this to Israelis, speaking of anti-Semitism, you would call him anti-Semitic. But for some reason to be anti-Palestinian in the same sense, of anti-Semitism, to be hateful towards and dehumanizing Palestinians is, cool, regular discourse. It just happens to be said by Israelis or said by Christians in the US or in Britain or what have you. It just replace that person with a Muslim and you would have a completely different response to what they're saying. So that's an embedded supremacist and racist discourse that exists in the West. I'm not seeing peace right now. Like, what we're looking for is a ceasefire. What we're looking for is the protection of the Palestinian civilians and citizens of Gaza. And then we need to talk about, I don't know what's going to happen. Israel, supposedly some documents were leaked recently that the Israeli plan in Gaza is to basically evict the Palestinians and force the Egyptian government to allow them into the Sinai desert and establish these, call them tent cities, basically just ethnically cleansing the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, and which for the Palestinians, this is very traumatic because this just reminds them of 48 and 67 of where the Palestinians were pushed out. And that's, for the Palestinians, is just a confirmation of what Israel is all about, is the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Palestine. I don't know if the end of this is going to be the end of Hamas. There are some talks about basically the eviction of Hamas members outside of Gaza into some Arab country. So I don't know if that's going to happen, but however this ends, and hopefully quickly and hopefully without one more Palestinian killed, some kind of a semblance of a desire for ending the conflict would come about. I don't know if the US is not interested in this. Biden is interested in winning the next elections and having this unwavering support for Israel, considering the power of the Israel lobby in the US and money and the political discourse in the US. He has to be unequivocal in his support for Israel because he wants to win the elections. If he comes out soft, he's going to lose elections. So that, ironically, the situation in Palestine is dictated by American presidential elections next year. The West also has come out in a very terrible position for Western countries. I don't know if you saw the vote in the UN a few days ago, overwhelming support for a humanitarian pause and a ceasefire by the vast majority of the world. Only 14 countries voted against that resolution. It was the US and Israel and some random African and Caribbean countries that have no power. But there's an international consensus that this has to end and the Palestinians have to be protected. Hopefully we can move towards a two-state solution. Hopefully we can work towards justice. I personally do not, I should not bring this up right now at the end, but I do not support the two-state solution per se. I support a one-state solution, a binational state solution where all people have the same equality and the rights in the land, where Jews can come and worship in Bethlehem, Palestinians can go swim in Tel Aviv. Everyone is treated equally. The problem with the one-state solution, it doesn't work right now because Israel defines itself as an ethno-religious state for Jewish people, and it's not actually a secular democracy that guarantees a freedom and equality for everyone. So it's fundamentally a racist state that implements apartheid. But hopefully we can move towards a binational kind of one-state solution for both people, where everyone would be equal under the law. But until then, we can pursue the two-state solution, the end of the occupation. I don't know if Israel has that political will. The occupation pays. They get so much power and money from the US. Our tax dollars, myself and Andrew's, $3.8 billion go to Israel annually to support the military occupation. Christians in the West support Israel for their own Christian and end times kind of nonsense.
Yeah.
So there's a lot that is happening in the West, especially a lot of it is driven by guilt and trauma and like embarrassment about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, which what makes this difficult. And then in many ways, the Palestinians are kind of paying for the sins of Christians in the West. But hopefully we can move beyond that kind of binary way of thinking and kind of think creatively about justice and human rights as the foundation of how we do foreign policy and implementation of UN resolutions and international law. And I think if the US and the West would, for 1 second, treat Palestinians like Ukrainians, as both people under occupation and war, while we hail Ukrainians as heroes and Palestinians are terrorists. So until we can change that discourse and see the humanity and the dignity of every Palestinian, it's going to be very hard for us to reach like a solution that is based on justice and therefore peace. And and just to finish with this point, Israel can never have any security or any peace when it actively oppresses Palestinians. We use the slogan, no justice, no peace. Establish justice and then peace would come out automatically and easily and organically. So we need to pursue justice, and hopefully pursuit of justice would lead to peace and then the end of the conflict. Hopefully.
Thank you for your time, Daniel. Have a very pleasant evening. Andrew?
We have only scratched the surface.
Yeah.
And you are always welcome on Still Unbelievable. I sincerely hope that you will come back. For the Still Unbelievable listeners, I do have this one message. Over the last 3 shows, it has become crystal clear that the conflict that we are witnessing, this war between Israel and Hamas, is not a simple one. And to pick a side and just watch the news cycle as if this is simple and there is a right and a wrong is the kind of narrow-mindedness that is very likely to keep us in war. We're not going to solve the problem on Still Unbelievable. It's out of our power. But if you will just recognize, our listeners, if you will just recognize that this is not simple, that there are human beings, not humans and terrorists. If you will just recognize that and just say that to each other, maybe we have some hope of working toward a long-term solution. I am convinced, and I will take this stand from now on, that the news cycle is not doing this conflict, this war, the kind of justice that you, our Still Unbelievable listeners, deserve. And so I ask you to dig deeper. That's all I think we can ask. We won't get to a solution. We don't have that kind of power. But we can ask you, our listeners, to be better informed. And we hope we have done part of that here. Daniel, thank you again, and please come back to Still Unbelievable.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure. Appreciate you guys.
And until next time, dear listeners, be reasonable. You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.